So, welcome to each one of you to this special book discussion that we have organized. And this is on the Indus Basin Uninterrupted. And as the subtitle of the book says, a history of territory and politics from Alexander to Nehru. And this very flawlessly written book is by Uttam Kumar Sinha, Dr. Uttam Kumar Sinha. I will be introducing the speaker later on. And as the book says, actually, I mean, there are a lot of narratives which are there in the book, and it's quite interesting to go through each one of these narratives, which have a story to tell about the Indus Waters Treaty that we constantly talk about today. And just recently, the Indus commissioners from both Pakistan and India met, and after a long hiatus, in fact. And we are yet to see where the treaty is going to be in the future because of the long drawn rivalry between India and Pakistan. But what Dr. Sinha tries to remind us is that 60 years of Indus Waters Treaty is not what defines the Indus Basin itself. There's almost 5,000 years of history that goes behind the basin to understanding the territorial contestations, the conflicts, the politics, the great game, and a whole lot of other politics which have defined this the subcontinental politics. So I don't want to talk about a lot of things which I will be talking about as a discussion later on. So without much ado, I would like to first invite Dr. Nand Kishore, head in charge of Department of Geopolitics and International Relations, to give the welcome remarks. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Dhanashri. First and foremost, my special thanks and welcome to Dr. Uttam Sinha. This is his first ever interaction with the Department of Geopolitics and International, to which I'm extremely happy. Though I've interacted with him before, things did not materialize the way I wanted to, but nevertheless, we have started. I think this is only the beginning and it will go a long way. We'll have many more interactions with Dr. Sinha. In fact, I remember when he was also the editor of another book on Mr. Modi. That's when I actually wanted him to interact with our students and then share his thoughts. But subsequently, things did not happen the way I anticipated it to be. But I'm extremely happy that the first one itself is happening on a subject that's so novel, that's been so less researched, and also there are stereotypes that are attached to. And I could only get some experts from this particular work. It was very, very interesting to look at the way I think the idea behind any river or any civilization, they somehow are interconnected. That's first and foremost. Second, how since time immemorial, people have utilized some of these rivers as life rivers, and then subsequently at every intervention, whether it was from Alexander, the way the book itself has been titled, from Alexander to Nehru, at a different point of time, like a process, like how foreign policy is a process, like a process, how it moved from one generation to the other generation. And then it was very interesting to see the idea of Bakranangal coming at a very early stage, somewhere around in the 1910, 1912 sort of time. And then the same was picked up by Mr. Nehru, and then he ended up calling it as modern India's modern temples and so on and so forth. And then the building of the Yamuna canals, to so many things. I think it's extremely beautiful. But more than any of these things, Sinha's take on the Indus Water Treaty, saying that it had nothing to do with peace, nor it had anything to do with politics, but rather it was much more to manage the territory, it was much more to manage the resources, is a very interesting take, and perhaps a very, very fresh take. And I think this is directly helpful because in quite a few courses, we are teaching the confidence building measures with regard to India, Pakistan, keeping the confidence building measures from the perspective of Indus Water Treaty. So it traverses through a lot of these anecdotes that we also talk about, but in a completely different manner. So I myself am extremely eager to listen to Dr. Sinha's take on the work that he has done, and subsequently by Dr. Dhanashri as a discussant. She was extremely enthusiastic to go through this work, and it is she who initiated, though the thought simultaneously ran through me that we should ask Dr. Sinha to deliberate and talk to our students and the faculty. But it was she who enthusiastically picked it up, and then she said, let's have it. As she mentioned that perhaps if we had all our students around here, and if there was also a possibility of having Dr. Sinha here, nothing would have been greater than that one. It would have been an extremely happy moment for us. But nevertheless, something that we have materialized, and things have come to this conclusion where we are able to have him with us, and then also Dr. Dhanashree to discuss this particular work. I think it's an extremely important contribution to the body of knowledge. That much I can acknowledge. This will go a long way. And I don't think Dr. Sinha should stop with this one. I think he needs to work beyond, from Nehru to Modi. Also, he needs to look at how Indus has been so far, because it has also stirred up a lot of political controversies and the things that our neighbors are talking about. So I think his next part should be perhaps on that one, from Nehru to Modi. The Indus water from Nehru to Modi would be an extremely interesting work too. But nevertheless, every contribution will have certain take homes, and this one perhaps was much more interesting. We have asked this to be procured to our library very soon. I think we'll have, and students will also have an access to the copy, and perhaps they can also buy copies, and they can read by themselves, those of them who are interested. Now, without wasting much time, and also seeing to it that Dr. Sinha will be able to speak much more to our students, and listening to the horse's mouth is always much more interesting and important. So, Dr. Sinha, once again, welcome to Department of Geopolitics and International Relations. From now on, we'll have more and more interactions with you. I will collaborate also with you much more, and happy to have you here, sir. Over to you, Dhanashree. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. So as Dr. Nandkishore mentioned, this is a huge journey that Dr. Sinha has covered. So it's not very easy to cover all of it, but I'm sure Dr. Sinha will try to cover as much as he can in his author's remarks. But before that, let me try and introduce him. So he has a huge bio, but then I'm just going to keep it short. Dr. Uttam Sinha is one of India's leading commentators on transboundary water issues. After a brief stint in the print media and a doctoral degree from Jawaharlal Nehru University, he joined the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis in 2001. It's now renamed as Manohar Parrikar IDSA, where he heads the Non-Traditional Security Center and is the managing editor of Strategic Analysis, the Institute's flagship journal published by Routledge. He's a recipient of many fellowships, including Senior Fellow at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, 2018 to 20, which also incidentally helped him write this book. An academic visitor at the Harvard Kennedy School in 2015, Shevning Gurukul Scholar at the London School of Economics and Political Science in 2008, and a visiting fellow at the Peace Research Institute, Oslo in 2006. His noted works include Riverine Neighborhood, Hydropolitics in South Asia, which was published in 2016, Climate Change Narrative, Reading the Arctic, published in 2014. His edited and co-edited volumes include The Modi Doctrine, New Paradigms in India's Foreign Policy, which Dr. Nandkishore spoke about earlier, Non-Traditional Security Challenges in Asia, Approaches and Responses, published in 2015 by Routledge, Arctic, Commerce, Governance and Policy, again published by Routledge in 2015, and Emerging Strategic Trends in Asia, published by IDSA in 2015. So as you can see, he has a wide range of works attributed to himself. And this is not just non-traditional security issues, but also India's foreign policy and issues related to the subcontinental history itself. So I would like to now invite Dr. Sinha to give his author's remarks, and maybe you can talk about your journey as to why you took up this very interesting topic to work on, and also the journey through this writing of the book itself, and what are the interesting things that you came across during the period of writing it. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Dhanashree. Thank you, Dr. Nandkishore, for your kind words and kind introduction. I think you were both very perceptive in saying that, I have to think about another volume from Nehru to Modi, and this is precisely what I'm thinking about and started some work on it. So I'm glad you mentioned it, and hopefully in a year or so, you'll find the second volume itself, and that will be interesting. I think you're quite right, Dhanashree, that all books, when you write or you engage with research, I think it's a journey in itself. And we all like to write a book, I think, because we simply feel that there's an idea to communicate, or a body of knowledge and information that you'd like to share for the wider audience, I think. But when you start writing a book, there are serious problems that come up. And I think the devil inside you often tells you, what's the point of writing a book which, no one is going to read, whether it's really worth it. Certainly, you're not going to make any money out of it, that's for sure. So, you tend to get sort of disillusioned by the sheer rigor of writing a book. A certain fatigue grips in, and there's often an inflection point, where you decide whether you really want to go ahead or you just want to withdraw and pack it up. And I think writing this book, and it was an exercise of about 2 years, I think there came many a point where I thought I would retreat and just forget about it, because it was getting very complex. There was just too much of information available. And there were many points where I just thought, I should just stop it. And I think it is that point, I think you learn that either you stop it or you go ahead. And fortunately for me, with all luck and whatever I had resources with me, I went ahead. And I think in the process of writing a book, any book, you learn and unlearn many things. I think you learn to be disciplined. That's for one. You learn to cross-check your references. That's very important in terms of academic writing. You start noting down the sources very meticulously, especially when you're looking at archives, because if you miss one particular page of an archive, then it's very difficult to get back again, because there's a whole lot of process in getting back to the pages there. And I think the dictionary, whether it's Oxford Dictionary or Cambridge Dictionary, it becomes a very important companion to you. And I think these are some elements that I sort of experienced. And then you start realizing, when you start writing a book, is that you want to communicate rather than write. And I think this is a very important starting point. We all think that we are all great writers, we all want to write, but I think we need to be effective communicators in whatever we bring into the table, especially when it comes to academic writing. Much of academic writing tends to be pedantic. I think we don't tend to communicate the message effectively, because it gets drowned and confused in the parlance of academic languages, etc. So I think we need to be quite simple in our style of communication. And I think I seriously looked into this aspect when I was writing this book, that the book needs to be communicated to a larger audience, and you have to bring in that effectiveness in the process of writing a book. I think it was Stephen King, and I'm sure many students must have read him, who wonderfully described that books are uniquely portable magic. And that's what books are, really. You carry it around, you can sleep with it, you can eat and read simultaneously, you can carry it along in journeys. It's a wonderful thing. It's one of the biggest engagement that a human being does, engages with book, reading constantly, learning through its experiences, etc. And I think whenever one is writing a book, reading becomes a constant source of unearthing extra information. So I think students should get interested in books, not just writing, but also reading. I think that's essentially very important. When you write a book, you have to essentially read and read and read more and more. So let me come to the book itself. And I think it starts with having a catchy title, I think, Uninterrupted. I think that's the key word in the book. And I think it says a lot of things, because it says a continuity of history that the river goes through. And the jacket itself was carefully designed. I think the jacket had a sort of a touch about history, because it captures the Battle of Sutlej in the winter months of 1845-46. That's the first Anglo-Sikh war. And the river's play a very important part of battle tactics and strategies. And then if you look at the back jacket, you will find the signing of the Indus Water Treaty on this very shining and well-polished teak table, and sitting in the middle is, Pakistan's president and chief martial law administrator Ayub Khan. He's quite proud and feeling quite elated about signing the treaty. And on the left, you have the vice president of the World Bank. The World Bank acted as an important third party in the negotiating process of the Indus Treaty. And on the right is Nehru, who visited Karachi to sign this treaty. And in fact, that was his last visit, because he never then visited Pakistan ever again, having died in 1964. So I think these two, the jacket representation is pretty striking. It sort of builds a connection between history and present. And as you know, history, all history is nothing but contemporary history. And I think that's the whole idea of looking at the book, is the contemporariness of the Indus Basin itself. It has a huge history behind it, but it's incredibly relevant in the context of the present time, in terms of water management issues, in terms of the climate change impact, in terms of the politics that defines the Indus Basin with India and Pakistan. So it is a very dynamic subject, a very dynamic theme, and the history behind it is absolutely fantastic. You learn so many things as you look into the history of the Indus Basin. So I think, what was also very important, especially for the publisher, I thought, was the timing of the book itself. 100 years ago, 1921, we started excavating the sites, the Harappa and the Mohenjo-daro sites. And that was a watershed movement in terms of India's historical timeline. I think we started moving back and beyond. It gave us a certain historical civilizational legacy, that we got to know that our history really goes way back into time and didn't actually start with Alexander of Macedonia coming into India. So we sort of created what is called a civilizational cradle. And that was quite significant in 1921. And we're going to mark 100 years of that digging and excavation that happened. Also, I think the period also marks 60 years of the Indus Waters Treaty. And I think that again was timeliness to the whole project that I was engaged with. 60 years of the treaty that has remained uninterrupted and uninterruptible, because the treaty itself has functioned despite the high politics, despite the animosity and mistrust. The treaty continues to function, and 60 years, 2020 marked 60 years of the treaty. And soon India will be celebrating 75 years of its independence, and therefore a lot of, I'm sure a lot of work will happen in the partition period, a lot of work will happen in the early formation of India's state machinery, etc. And I think a lot of attention would also be put on certain areas where we missed. And I thought it's a good time to bring in, when we're looking at the partition, to bring in how the civil engineers really influenced the political leaders of India in particular. And there's a huge section, as you will read, on civil engineers influencing leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru, Sardar Patel, especially the civil engineers of Punjab and the civil engineers of Bikaner, in influencing them to sort of relook at the boundary line that was being drawn by Ratcliffe, and so-called shift the boundary line according to the interest of India. And I think the canals and the headwork canals played a very critical and crucial role in sort of shaping what was going on at the time of the boundary line being withdrawn. So that was, I thought, the timing was also critical to the book itself. And I think publishers like the timing aspect, especially big time publishers. As students, I think, and we all understand that rivers are quite intriguing, just like history. And the two, history and rivers, are very intricately intertwined. Rivers, as we know, have shaped the course of history, whether it's the Nile, whether it's the Mesopotamia, whether it's the Yellow River in China. I think all great civilization have flourished around rivers. And I think this is the beginning of history, I think, in many sense. It almost, draws you, river civilization draws you into the realms of the past. When you look at the rivers, you know that there is a history to it, a legacy to it, an unfolding of events to it. And rivers, all rivers, have a certain history around it. And when you go into history, when you study history, when you flip the pages of history, you find it very, very engaging, you find it very intriguing, and you discover so many things that one tends to generally not know. And I think this is what I experienced when I started going back on the Indus River. I initially thought to begin with the partition and end with the signing of the treaty, just look at 13 years of the politics around the rivers. Politics becomes insignificant if you don't understand the history of the river basin. And as I went back, I kept going back till I reached the Indus civilization, and that became the starting point of this book. And I think all river civilization, whether it's Mesopotamia, the Nile, the Yellow River, I think it reflects a certain richness through its history. There is always, as I said in the book, a distinct impetuosity with changing hydrological profiles. As the river bed changes, it also influences the culture, the people, the politics, and the history around it. And the Indus in particular, I think, more than any other river civilization, has remained a very powerful symbol of the passage of time, which has influenced very sharply the socio-political landscape, the institutional structures that came about, the technological intervention. I think many of the far-reaching technological knowledge was cast on the canals and the irrigation system of the rivers by the British. They were the front runners in terms of canal building and irrigation facilities. That knowledge we still carry even today. And also what we often forget is the evolution of the legal structures around sharing of the waters. There was a lot of sort of not conflict, but differences between Punjab and Sindh during the colonial time. Sindh was quite disturbed by the way Punjab was handling the water resources. And the way to deal with it was also to bring in the legal the legal mechanisms. That increasingly became an important aspect when we were negotiating, when India and Pakistan were negotiating the Indus Waters Treaty. So we see a history of river waters engaging with people, engaging with kings and monarchs, political leaders afterwards. And we see a great deal of commerce evolving, as well as peace initiatives. And there was, of course, a wide share of disputes and conflict. So it was very dynamic. It was an interesting plate full of these ingredients that define history. And these, in a way, influenced the basin even in the 21st century. I think what I've done is, without really, I'm not a historian, so I haven't put on my inquiry lens when I'm looking at history. I look at the Indus history through the characters, that run along the timeline of the Indus, right till the Indus Waters Treaty is signed in 1960. So you'll find a lot of characters, starting with Alexander of Macedonia and Porus, the way they looked at the rivers, the way they shaped their tactics, war tactics, and a certain amount of political strategy around it. So the lens has been to look at this huge historical timeline of the Indus through the characters. And you'll probably find, and I have not done a count, but probably you'll find more than 150 characters, put into the book, and the whole vista of the Indus is examined through some of their concerns. There's a whole lot of pride in the way they sort of conquer rivers, or sort of put this supreme amount of control over rivers. There's a huge amount of pride in a lot of characters here. There's, of course, the question of power and envy. There is, of course, fear simultaneously. Elements of desperation comes in through various characters. And many a time, I think, the Indus is defined through sheer greed. I think these are actions and consequences that have been hugely momentous in terms of the Indus Basin. And each of these actions have resulted in a certain defining moment, which I have captured. I think I've also very carefully used the word basin. I know we very loosely use the word the Indus, as if Indus is the complete basin in itself. Basin is an important prefix to the Indus because it pleases the hydrologist and the environmentalist. They like the word basin, especially in the present hydrological context, because we have to look at the basin as a sort of a symbiotic relationship, not of the exploitation of rivers and the waters, but the interconnection of the many tributaries or the many water bodies that feed into the main river itself, and therefore that cannot be lost. The basin, as you technically look at it, is a land dissected and drained by many streams, and we cannot ignore that. Each element that go into making the basin is critically important, and therefore in the book I have acknowledged from time to time historically the sources of the rivers, the watershed areas, the confluences of the rivers, the mouth. What do you mean by the mouth and the politics around it, the tributaries, etc., etc. So, readers will also get comfortable and familiar with these hydrological concepts, which was also very important. While the politics played out, while territories were marked, I think these important hydrological information were equally very important. Now, I'm not being modest, but I do not claim that I have written anything or something that is completely unknown. I have, in a sense, given my time at the Jawaharlal Nehru Memorial Library, which has huge archive, huge material. I have merely unearthed facts and information. And probably what I have done as an effort is to present it in a very easy, readable way. So I think even a class 9th and 8th student can enjoy reading it as much as scholars like you, researchers like you, can enjoy reading it. I think effective communication, as I said in the beginning, is very important today. Whenever you write what is called popular history, I think the book is less pedantic, and I try to also package information very interestingly so that it whets the appetite and sort of creates curiosity for the reader. I must stress that, as I said, I do not interpret history here. I'm not a historian. I only, in a sense, and the book narrates it through historical characters. And when you look at characters, it's always very interesting. There's a lot of curiosity around characters. There's bits of information that will sort of interest you while one is reading it. But let me just get back to a bit of the current day writing on history. You are students of political science, but I think history is inescapable. Historians, often feel that the further they get back from the present, the more scholarly they become. I think all history, to a great extent, is contemporary history, and that's been my intention, really. Of course, a lot of people, historians, have their scholarly place. I'm not challenging all that, but history to me is a lot about the relevance of the today. And I wanted to explore the contemporariness of the history of the Indus and water issues in particular, especially the transboundary nature of water issues as you see particularly in South Asia, whether it's with India and Pakistan or India and Nepal or India and Bangladesh. It requires complex judgments, you see, and lots of timely and holistic policy interventions. So I think it's very important, especially when it comes to the basins in South Asia, to know its history, because it tells you many things. It makes you unlearn some of the things that you're doing today. And I think that's the value of history when you're particularly looking at the basins in South Asia. We cannot afford to be historically ignorant to the basins around us. Therefore, we have to look at the present in a certain sense through the eye. I mean, we have to look at the past, I think, with the eye of the present. I think, in the Indus Basin in particular, typically defines this. I think the study of history, we might be political science students, but I think the study of history helps one to discern what the story is. I think that's also very important. And I wanted to get the story out, not just merely what the problem is, but what the story is around it. You know, the story, as I said, of greed, of ambition, of war, of envy, etc., of profits. I wanted to get that story out around the river. And it really helps to determine the who, you know, the what, the when, the where, the how, and the why of a narrative. So I think that gets into the whole book, and I try to weave that together to the best possible way I can. And I'll probably leave it to the readers to judge how good that was or how interesting that was. So that was something quite different in the way I tackled and I approached this book. Much of my earlier writing was typically done in what is called an academic framing, with a structure, you know, with a sort of you know, the concept, the context, and then problematizing the issue. That's what we are trained to do as researchers. But this book and the approach I had was radically different from the earlier approach to writing books. Of course, history, and if I have to use the academic tool, is you know, history is epistemologically very limited. You know, it has its limitation. You know, history can be, for example, interpreted in different ways. So one has to be very careful when one is going through archival materials. History can also be very easily misunderstood, and I'm sure when I have written this book, there would be areas where probably the readers might misunderstand what I'm trying to communicate. But that's how history is done. And third, I think in its limitation, history will always have gaps. And I think as researchers, as students, it's good to sometimes go back and try to fill in these gaps. I think there are tons and tons of information still available that when one excavates, you know, you'll find that the gaps will be filled. So there are lots of spaces in history that requires filling up with facts, more information, with more archival work and material. And I think that's what comes out in this book. I've probably done some part of that. It's not, I would say, definitive. I'm sure there must be enormous amount of archival material, information still to be excavated, but I'll probably leave that to others who want to, you know, get into writing more about the history of the Indus Basin. And definitely, this is not the last of the book, and certainly this was not the first. There's some very good books around which I think you should know about. For example, Alicia Albinia's book, The Empires of the Indus, sort of blends both history and travelogue. She's actually traveling in Pakistan from the mouth to the source of the Indus, and as she travels, she captures the geographical setting, also the historical narratives from places to places, and I think she blends it remarkably well. Sanjeev Sanyal's book, for example, Land of Seven Rivers, again captures not just the Indus but the other rivers of India, the Ganga, the Narmada, the Kaveri, etc., which again is, in a sense, is the history of India's geography, or you can say, as the book says, or the geography of India's history. It's important to know both the geography and the history of the great land of what is now today South Asia. So Indus has its, you know, academic work, which one, of course, reads and refers to. I think classic work by Alois Michael in 1967 captures the partition and the negotiation of the Indus Basin. There are historians, trained historians who have looked at the Indus Basin or looked at rivers and water. For example, Rohan D'Souza has a good body of work on the history of waters. David Gilmartin, for example, professor in New York University, has also looked at the Indus River, but in modern history. I think he's limited himself to the history which is modern, which obviously covers the partition and the post-partition negotiation. So there are books. Indus has always fascinated researchers, and there are plenty of books around. My book just adds to another in the list of reading, so to put it. So what is so different in the book, which I'd like to share? Well, I think the difference here is the timeline that I cover, and many would probably criticize it that 5,000 years of history is not easy to bring in to a book, and probably there'll be a lot of spaces that I have missed. But I did focus on the interlinked events and how one event influenced the other throughout this 5,000 years of the history of the basin. I do not know how effective that is, but that's what's my effort really, to connect each event to another and then bring it to a point of time where the Indus Basin, for the first time in its hydrological history, politically gets divided between two sovereign states, India and Pakistan, and I ended in 1960 as the basin being divided, but essentially still remaining uninterrupted. The book also has, and this is for researchers and students like you, an enormous amount of literature. The primary sources will trigger a lot of you to probably read it, look into it, and probably will give you a sort of broad picture of the politics and the negotiations of the time. The debates in the House of Commons in the 1850s and 1860s. It's interesting about how the British looked at the rivers in India, how the British shaped their frontier policy with Afghanistan. Those primary sources, I think, for me as a researcher also is to dig information and bring it to the public for others to do research upon. So to use those material for further research. I think that is also an element that we as researchers want to bring to the table. And I think, and I'm quite happy to have looked into these primary sources. There are 750 references in the book, and I know my publishers were pulling their hair when they first heard it, but I think in my constant conversation with them, I think I effectively justified that these references are critical to the text. I think that the entire text evolves based on these references, these diaries, these notes, these first-hand accounts, which I think without the reference to it would sound a little vague and incomplete. So I think Penguin, I don't think Penguin has ever had references of such extreme kind, I think. So I'm happy that they did, and I'm thankful to them. But once I had all this material, then the question arises, how do you want to frame it? What is your inquiry frame? And I think in the case of the Indus, it was simply territory and politics, because as we see invaders coming in from the West, as we see the British looking to Afghanistan from the Indus, it was greatly about the territory and the politics around it. And even in contemporary times, even today, I think transboundary rivers are essentially very territorial in its nature. We have, in a sense, in the 21st century, created what is called a hydropolitical security complex around river basins. And I think because it is so territorial, states also tend to get excessively protective about rivers and the waters. So we find a lot of high politics on rivers in particular. The Brahmaputra is an example here. The Indus, of course, is an example of high politics. But I think high politics is also controlled by the saner elements of peace building and treaties and mechanism. And that's also an important element that the state exercises. Rational egoists, as we call the state. So while the state might think in certain terms of control, leverages, and hegemonic expressions, it also from time to time thinks rationally in terms of institutional mechanism, in terms of treaty, in terms of dialogue and discussion. And I think this plays out very effectively on the rivers, particularly in South Asia. So there is a high degree of politics. Rivers are extremely emotive, and they are very, very divisive. And I think when I look at the Indus Basin and I explore it, I find these elements incredibly mixing with the basin itself. The politics, the emotions, and the divisiveness of the rivers. And I think the last bit, I think I've taken a lot of time here, is the style. I think it's important, as I said, to communicate effectively. The style is also very important in writing a book. So what really comes out in the book, and those of you who will read it, I'm sure many of you will, it's available in Amazon at a 30% discount. So you'll get it at 560 rupees, which is, I think, a good price, really. What comes out in the book is a narrative history. This is a style which we are getting very familiar with, and those who read will realize William Dalrymple, Ramachandra Guha, they employ this style of a narrative history. Many of the Indian writers today, not necessarily trained historians, are employing, like for example, if you pick up a book by Sudeep Chakravarti, The Placé, The Battle of Placé, you'll find this style very, very nicely done. Or Yashaswini Chandra's book, the latest one by Picador, The Tale of the Horse, A History of India on the Horseback. Again, it has this very engaging style, almost, at times the first person narration, as if you're seeing history, you're living history, a history that is, I think, well written and communicated to a broader audience. I think that's the style which I think I enjoyed doing. It was, for me, difficult, but I think I have a bit of a training in journalism, so that helped me. It brings in the more human elements to it. I think that's what the style is all about. Love, greed, power, conquest, jealousy, etc. The book, in its own deep research, tends to humanize the Indus rather than merely treating it as an exotic. It humanizes it. So you'll have all these failings of the humans and the characters and the leaders around the Indus Basin. Well, thank you. I hope I've been able to express something.
All right. Thank you so much, sir. So in fact, the depth with which you covered almost all aspects of the book, I mean, a lot of things which I read in the past couple of weeks, I could actually refresh them even more. And like you said, in the end, actually, the style of the book itself, in terms of historical narratives around characters, around historical figures, around people who you would not have really heard of before, although they are there in the history, but we don't talk about them as much as the leaders. So there's so much richness in the book itself that it covers a vast gamut of issues, in effect also humanizing the Indus, like you mentioned, because it's so important that Indus is not treated as an object, which is just something that has to be exploited or something that is for the use of the human beings or civilizations. It's also part of those things that we talk about. So that was really good exposition to the major points and a lot of interesting narratives that are there in the book. So as a discussion, what I'm going to do primarily is to just reflect on some of the things that I felt were that really caught my attention. And I'm also going to read a few excerpts from the book, if that's fine with you, because I feel some of these portions are so well written that it really makes you read even more. So like I couldn't keep the book down because of the way you have written some of the parts.
You are
And
being kind. You are being kind.
no, I'm not being kind, sir. I'm really serious because it's been after a long time that I'm reading this kind of narrative. So it was very interesting for me to pick on
Thank you.
things that, yeah, I have researched on the Indus, but never really gone so back. What you mentioned about going back to the Indus Valley civilization itself, and it's so important to do that at times to understand what's going on in the contemporary times. So I'm very happy that you agreed to actually have this book discussion in the first place, and also interact with some of our students who will be very much interested in this discussion. So let me get to the points. I'll keep it brief so that we also have time for Q&A. So like you mentioned, I think one of the first things that caught my attention was the way that you could bring out so many different imaginaries of the Indus, starting with the hydrological imaginary itself. When you talk about how the river changes its conditions, how it also has cultural, societal, and other kinds of impacts, whether it is on the Indus Valley civilization or even what came after that, with the invaders and the marauders and everyone else, including colonial empire, which was not, which also actually was affected by the way the Indus flows. So it has a lot of relevance for today's frameworks and arrangements that we talk about. Like you mentioned, today we are talking about decreasing water resources. We are talking about climate change. We are talking about so many different hydrological changes, the hydrological regime itself, which is changing. But when you look at historically as well, we could see similar trends at that time also. In fact, at one point of time, as you have written in your book as well, there were two rivers, Indus and Mehran. And then suddenly in the 19th century, once the British cartographers and surveyors came, the mentioning of Mehran stopped after that. And then it was just the Indus Basin. And the word basin there, which you mentioned in your exposition itself, kind of covers how the basin-wide approach is kind of has had a lot of impact on how we treat rivers even today, and something that has the imprint of the colonial empire itself. So there's one particular part which I really enjoyed reading was about Alexander's journey and his troops, how they were pretty much defeated by the Indus rather than anything else, and also the continuous kind of fight they received, where they were the receiving end of the Punjab tribes. So there's this one part which I really I thought I should read out, which is on page 10. It says, Alexander's march in the Punjab was halted at the banks of Hyphasis, which is Bias River. His army never got to face the Satluj Hesidros, which was further east of the Bias. Not surprisingly, the accounts of Alexander's voyage describe the 4 rivers instead of 5, which merged into the Indus. Of the rivers in the Indus system, Satluj has had a varied hydrological past, often not part of the basin configuration. So very interestingly, Satluj was not even considered part of the basin configuration at one point of time. Then you go on, it could have even been the lost river re-emerging later in time, or one of the other rivers which followed a different route to the ocean, and then subsequently, as widely presumed because of tectonic shifts, the course changed and joined the Indus Basin. So again, reflecting on some of the hydrological changes and how Alexander troops were constantly under the threat of the river's hydrological changes, as well as the cultural communities and societies that lived along the banks of the Indus and its tributaries in the basin. And later on, you say the point, without going into the lost and found Satluj debate, is that the Indus Basin, with its complex hydrology system, has always remained difficult to comprehend. And I think this is a story of the Indus, which I think should be highlighted, that this is something that we go on comprehending even today as to how do we understand the contemporary nature of Indus, which is still very complex to understand. And then, of course, you talk about the British frontier policy in Afghanistan, and very, very interestingly, you bring up this kind of the border drawing, where the British had already decided that this would be the border, again defined by the Indus Basin itself. So again, going back to the idea of how territories were defined on the basis of the river itself, and they continue to be defined basis on the basis of the river systems that we have inherited from the history. So the great game part was something that I really enjoyed reading, because you very effectively reflect on the kind of rivalry that existed between the Soviet or the Russian Empire and the British Empire, and how the British always wanted to protect this part of the subcontinent from any kind of invasion from the Russian Empire. And here again, you bring in issues of navigation, and I found that part again interesting, because at one point this was something that connected societies. And once, of course, the railways came in, once, of course, the bridges came in, the way the Indus was seen by whether it was the colonizers or the societies changed as well. So over there, you talk about Henry Pottinger, who actually observed in his detailed study in 1811 of the flow of Indus, that notwithstanding the great depth of water, the commerce is entirely carried on between Sindh and the Punjab and Afghanistan in flat-bottom boats that carry from 1 to 300 tons and are yet so constructed as to draw about a few feet water. So again, you can clearly see how the subcontinent was linked by the Indus, and it could navigate people, goods, and so many other things which were part of the trade and commerce which existed historically, and it was a very rich tradition that we had. And again, this was something that was facilitated by the Indus. And again, you go on, the viability of navigation and commerce remained an exciting prospect, especially for the British colonial empire. So again, looking at how the British used this opportunity to also enhance their commercial empire in the subcontinent. So it was in the 1813s that for the first time, navigation highway for sea-going vessels into the heart of the Punjab. So today, what we talk about Punjab, at that time, it was unified Punjab, one administration, West Punjab and East Punjab, so it became an objective. And then you say how the Sindh Amirs actually tried to, they tried their level best to keep the British away. And the Amirs of Sindh were worried rulers fearing British annexation of their territory. The British administration in Bombay, under the governorship of John Malcolm, who had taken over from Elphinstone, was gathering details about Sindh, its rulers, resources, revenue, trade, navigation. The acquisition of information was crucial for the British frontier policy and enhance. So that means that it was crucial for the British to understand the Indus itself, for it to enhance its presence in the subcontinent. So it was a crucial point in the British history or British colonial history in this part of the world. So that is another part which I wanted to read out. Then comes the partition part, which I think you have covered so well, and you have brought out so many different narratives there. And what I particularly liked was the way in which, of course, we talk about partition of land. How was a partition of waters done at that point in time, and how difficult it was? Radcliffe did it in a jiffy, like he was forced to do it in a matter of few weeks, which ideally should take someone at least 3 years, as you have mentioned in the book itself. And the way it was done was, of course, haphazard, and the way a lot of interests were there. So again, you bring in so many different characters there. And I'm very glad you mentioned in your exposition also that there were around 150 characters whom you have talked about in the book itself. And that is very important part of your book, because it is through these characters that the narratives are built into the history of the Indus. And one particular excerpt from this book this is page 146, which talks about partition. If anything else, the partition only brought the two dominions to a standoff, and the canal disputes which existed even at that time that soon arose added to the distrust. A deeply divided political landscape emerged in which the partition Punjab made future cooperation uncertain, and Kashmir made it completely difficult. The Indus Basin, one of the most homogeneous physiographic regions on earth, with the western rivers, that is Indus, Jhelum and Chenab, flowing unhindered into Pakistan, while the eastern rivers, that is Satluj, Bias and Ravi, ceaselessly crossing into Pakistan from India, was politically divided as never before in its history to meet a political compromise. So as you can see, this was an important period, because this basically defined what the Indus Waters Treaty would be, if you look at it. And that I think is also something, as he mentioned about the civil engineers at that time. He particularly talks about Kanwar Singh, who was a chief engineer in Bikaner Principality, and Sarup Singh, who was the civil engineer in Punjab. So he particularly talks about these two civil engineers who are able to impress upon the Indian government and the Britishers, and also on the Congress, the Indian National Congress, on leaders like Nehru, Patel, and everyone, that water is a strategic asset. We need to keep control of the head works, and that is a very important lesson that, again, we see something that is being reflected on as we talk about the Tibetan Plateau and how China is using the Tibetan Plateau as a strategic asset for itself. And this is something that we could also see how it was there during the history as well. So as he mentions on page 149, the new international boundary cut across the basin, giving the upper reaches of the main Indus and its eastern tributaries to India, while the lower reaches came to lie in Pakistan. So the modalities for the Indus Waters Treaty were already sort of laid down during that period. And one more thing, which is very, very interestingly, he brings out the Pakistan sphere. Pakistan sphere in the sense whether India would use this as a strategic asset and maybe as a bargaining chip against India. And this is a very important part which he covers here. He says the new frontiers set forth new political conditions. The constitutional provisions hitherto available for lower basin provinces to seek remedies against the upper provinces over use of river waters ceased to exist. Its vulnerability as a lower riparian country to what it considered a hostile India quickly dawned upon Pakistan. So this was right after the boundary was drawn, that Pakistan had already realized that this is going to be an albatross around its neck for the remaining part of its future. Thus, probably one of the first questions that the new government of Pakistan faced was riparian in nature. What would not a hostile India do? So this is the question that very, very, very categorically Dr. Sinha also mentions here. Very importantly, one thing he reiterates is Jinnah's thirst for partition overlooked the hydrological disadvantage. And that's a very important lesson there, that maybe partition was not really thought well by the Muslim League and particularly by Jinnah at that time. And there is actually, as Dr. Sinha mentioned, there is no evidence to suggest whether Jinnah factored the waters, except for an interesting fact that his paternal grandfather came from a decidedly well-watered province. So, this is pretty much what Jinnah, thought about at that point in time. And maybe it's also interesting for me to read the part about the civil engineers. And there's one paragraph on page 160, where he says, how did the Firozpur headworks come to India? Now, this is a very interesting part, because it should have ideally gone to Pakistan because it is Muslim majority area. But it came to India because of the work done by some of the civil engineers. Now, while much of the partition history is about the role of the great leaders, their differences, actions, and miscalculations, the foresightedness of the Indian civil engineers in understanding the seriousness of the asset distribution, in this case, the headworks, and their fear of India being at a disadvantage by the boundary has received inadequate attention. And there's this Kanwar Singh's account, which is very, very interesting to read, and as to how they come about this understanding that we need to have control over this no matter what, because this may actually define the future of the sharing of the Indus waters. At some point in time, the negotiations had to happen, and this is something that the leaders also clearly understood. And then the next parts are actually, again, when the part about the Indus Waters Treaty and how it was signed, it was a very, very long and arduous journey in itself. And the negotiations went on, and that part actually captures a lot of idea of Nehru's idea of, Nehru's worldview itself on the one hand, also India's foreign policy and the kind of differences that existed within India on how the Indus has to be looked at. And it's very interesting also, you keep on pointing out that Punjab, the East Punjab at that time had their own view of the Indus, and they wanted to do it their way, while Nehru had a different way of dealing with the Indus. And that's very important lesson for IR scholars in particular, who look at it maybe at the state level, interstate level, but there are so many domestic dynamics which also influence how these decisions are arrived at. And very interestingly, you talk about Pakistan and how they always wanted a solution wherein a third party or international party would come in. And this is something, again, as IR scholars, international relations scholars, we see that how Pakistan continues to internationalize issues related to whether it is the Indus Waters Treaty or Kashmir or various other issues that comes up from time to time. And in fact, there's a part on that's page number 202 in which you mention that that Pakistan lent ever more so towards the UN, which it felt was the only forum that could protect the weaker country from the wrongs of the powerful nations. Simultaneously, it changed the expressions on the canal dispute dramatically from 1951, referring to the canals as international canals and describing India's waters uses as interference. So very clearly, in quotes, interference, all these things, all these narratives from the Pakistan side, particularly how they use the media, how they use different other actors to already use propaganda as a means of achieving its ends was very clear in the 1950s itself, which also, by the way, had a huge impact on the outcome of the Indus Waters Treaty itself. And very, very interestingly, you bring about that part. And I really like the way you have spoken in length about the letters exchanged between Nehru and Liaquat Khan, between Nehru and Zafrullah Khan, between so many leaders and also the Lok Sabha, the parliamentary discussions that happened where a lot of leaders, including Atal Bihari Vajpayee at that time, raised a lot of issues with the way the Indus Waters Treaty was signed. It's very interesting to note how some of these dynamics worked out. And maybe I'll stop with two more excerpts here, very short. And I really liked the part where you talk about the World Bank. And this is really interesting because this is something that we all wonder, why was the World Bank part of the treaty in the first place? How did it come about? Again, this had a lot to do with the geopolitics of that time, when the US kind of saw an opportunity in meddling with the South Asian or subcontinental politics, especially at a time when the British were kind of weaning away from the region as much as possible. And that's where the World Bank came in. And very, very, very interesting note here on page number 230. It's quite remarkable that the World Bank, with no political or ideological appeal, and scorned as a capitalist and prejudiced agent by the Indian system, became deeply involved in what was, after all, an internal and sensitive matter for India. So that's an interesting part, because to Nehru, capitalism appeared to have failed and found in the Soviet style of progress, with its central planning and public sector investment, a model to be considered with an added anti-colonialism and socialism appeal. Now, that was Nehru's worldview, but what we also saw was how India was desperate for aid and grant from the World Bank itself, and a lot of projects, even in Pakistan, were dependent on aid and grant. So it was kind of imperative for both countries to have World Bank involved, and that is a kind of dependence that the World Bank, particularly the US, kind of engaged in from the beginning itself. And by the end of the treaty, there were a lot of allegations, of course, whether this was in India's interest and whether India should have just, resolved the dispute way back when the partition happened, when Pakistan's demands were much, much, much lesser. And as the negotiations went on, India kept on losing more and more ground, which is what you have also written in your book. And which is where I think very interestingly you bring about Nehru's worldview and Nehru's foreign policy. And this excerpt from page 272. However skillfully Nehru tried to separate himself as a carrier of a broad perspective from the nitty-gritty of the negotiations that the engineers engaged in, there was an undeniable Nehruvian internationalist mindset to the entire water issue with Pakistan. Nehru's interest in international problems was well known. His ideals of oneness, though clashed with the realities of power politics and interest-oriented relations, which he understood but adamantly refused to accept. More than a decade ago, he had hoped for an emergence of Asia as an influence on world peace, which soon fell apart. So, and then you go on talking about Bandung Conference and others. So very clearly what you could see. And in fact, there are a lot of portions where you talk about how he tied it to evacuee property issue and a lot of other issues, which may not have been the right way to go about the negotiations itself. But in hindsight, there's a lot of things that we can question. Of course, the situation he was in and the kind of opposition he faced from various corners within the country and outside. There are a lot of question marks over how it was arrived. And of course, as you move on and talk about the parliamentary discussions, it's very interesting because we still don't know if there are some issues with the way the treaty was signed and whether it was ratified and what was the outcome of it in terms of, there are some interesting parts which also question whether this would be joint kind of management of waters itself. So these are some of the excerpts which I wanted to point out, and some of the things which I would like to mention. One is like how you kind of mix that technocracy with politics, and it's very interesting because we constantly talk about technocratic solutions to environmental problems or how you manage water resources. But are they taking into consideration political questions and territorial questions? And you very, very interestingly bring out those kind of problems. And you, in fact, in one part of the book, you also say that the civil engineers were not able to consider these political questions at all, which is why a lot of narratives around the Indus waters was more or less very technocratic, whereas the political wrangling, is going on even today. So it was more like a technocratic solution. So I have a lot more to say, but it's probably time for me to stop. And I have a few questions as well, which as a discussant, I hope I can ask you. But before that, if there are questions from students and other members of the audience who have joined from outside the department also, please raise your hand. And or unmute yourself and you can ask the question. Are there any quick questions? Yes, Dr. Anand, yes.
Thank you, Dr. for the excellent discussions about your book. It's a very important book. I really like to read such kind of books are very much rooted in geography, history, and having a political component associated with it. Now, the question which I would like to ask you is something which is more to do with the cultures of India and Pakistan. Now, with respect to India and Pakistan, we know very well about how attached is a particular position to the Indus River as the Sindhu. But at the same time, how does the Pakistanis see it today? What, apart from just the river, what are the other dimensions of the Indus River? And secondly, I would also like to from the perspective of either bank of the Indus River. Is there a major cultural difference on both sides of or either sides of the Indus River, which is anything significant? And one more question which I would like to ask you is that why has in India, even though the name India itself comes from the Indus, all of our attention, even when it comes to our mythology or our own culture, has been focusing on the river Ganga and not. So these are some of the things that came to my mind, maybe to ask you. Thank you.
Yeah. Can I respond?
Yes, please, sir. Yeah.
Well, I couldn't really get the question very clearly, but if I can make a sense of what you were trying to say because of the disturbance, was how does Pakistan look at the rivers, right? Is that? I think it's obviously a question that one tends to ask. That after all, the basin is between two countries, but the basin was one at one point of time, and therefore, in terms of cultural alignment, in terms of cultural cohesiveness, it was also very much one. You see, when boundaries are divided, it is quite artificial. Hydrologies are exceptionally natural and cohesive. boundaries are artificial, and it has a political dynamics to it. So what happened on the basin in terms of the division was an artificial one. It was sort of an exaggerated intervention that unnaturally divided the basin into 3 and 3. But you see, we often misread the basin today as India giving away too much to Pakistan. Remember, for our interest, the eastern rivers were very, very critical and important in terms of the economic development and the planned water project that Nehru and his government had planned in Punjab, with the Bhakra Nangal in particular. So retaining the control of the eastern rivers for us was, in a sense, in the long years of negotiation for us, was an important victory, that we retained our complete and exclusive right on the eastern rivers so that we could use the water for our immediate development, economic development, agrarian development. We gave away the western rivers to Pakistan, which flowed from Kashmir into Pakistan, the Jhelum and the Chenab in particular. Of course, the Indus, a certain portion of that which flows. But we also got some rights on the western rivers, which was 3.6 million acre feet of water to use as storage. And that storage could be used for hydropower, for irrigation and non-consumptive uses. What we have not done in the western rivers is utilize those provisions. What we have done is utilize the provisions of the eastern rivers maximum, but we haven't really utilized the provision of the western rivers. Now, what Pakistan sees that while Pakistan has signed the treaty in all its full consciousness, signed by Ayub Khan, what it tries to always emphasize is not the letter of the treaty, which says 3 rivers to India, 3 rivers to Pakistan, and technically defines what all India can do and what all Pakistan can ask. What it tries to say is the spirit of the treaty, which means that Pakistan is a lesser, lower, weak, bechara country, and therefore India has to be constantly generous and forgiving and allow waters to continuously flow. So the spirit of the treaty has to be maintained. That means India should be generous where it counts. India should give away water when it wants to for the needs of Pakistan. So I think this is quite important to understand the letter and the spirit of the treaty. And in the spirit of the treaty, I think India has done remarkably well in the last 60 years, despite the wars, despite 1998, despite a number of cross-border terrorism and intrusion, that India has still maintained the spirit of the treaty and not abrogated it, right? So I think this is very important. Now, culturally, I think, as I said, culturally, the Indus Basin in Pakistan has a lot of significance, has a lot of value. I think the entire breadbasket concept, the irrigation facility, all happened largely in what is now the Pakistan side. Pakistan got the intricate canal system, which was built from the Mughal days, even the practices of the Indus civilization, in terms of water storing and in terms of water channeling. That knowledge was all in the part of Pakistan. So in terms of knowledge gain, in terms of knowledge transmitted, in terms of water resource management, Pakistan is very much alive to it, you see. But it is the political establishment that has turned around water into an instrument of what is called its relationship with Pakistan. So culturally, Pakistan remains quite alive to the knowledge of water, to the knowledge of water management. Politically, and the ruling class, however, uses water in terms of bilateral politics. So the result has been that at the end of the day, there is less emphasis on the cultural value of water in Pakistan and more emphasis on the political value of water in Pakistan.
Thank you. There was another question from Dr. Anand, which was about that why culturally India, although the name India comes from the Indus, why do we identify more with, say, a river like Ganga and not so much with Indus? So this is another question that he asked towards the end. Yeah.
Well, it's also because of a hydrological reality. The Indus, the entire volume of the Indus flows in India, right? So it can be easily managed. You have, one oriented policy. It's a one state stakeholder to the river, whereas Indus has become difficult because of the division of the Indus, because of two sovereign states that govern now. It's transboundary now, whereas Ganga is not transboundary in that sense. At least major portion of the Ganga in its utility is in India, and then it flows into Bangladesh. So I think that is politically more convenient to manage. Also, I think over the years, and this is a bit of an irony, because while we talk about navigation utility on the Ganga and the Brahmaputra, the whole idea of navigation had actually started on the Indus. And this is something that we don't really look into the Indus. Also, again, I think because Indus is now divided, you have politically divided the river. So you can't really think about a cohesive format on the Indus. You can't think about a navigation only on a certain portion. Navigation has to have a sort of a long utility and therefore a long portion of the river. And in the case of the Indus, it flows into Pakistan and there's a portion in India. So it becomes politically difficult to manage many of the things that we want to do on the Indus Basin. So what India concentrates on today is to just simply look at the provisions that is entitled to India on the Indus. That is to build more storage capacity on the western rivers, to build hydroelectricity projects, to increase its irrigation facility. All that is defined under the provision of the Indus. Navigation, unfortunately, has no scope of discussion at this moment. The Tulbul navigation project, which was started in Kashmir for the benefit of the Kashmiris in terms of movement of goods, which was very important in difficult mountainous regions, was stalled by Pakistan because there is a number of objections to it. So my suggestion is that I think we should restart the Tulbul navigation project in Sopore of Kashmir and try to also emphasize in our dialogue with Pakistan through the Indus commissioners the utility of navigation. Of course, it will require a huge political breakthrough to have navigation flowing from India to Pakistan. That will require a huge political breakthrough. Whereas on the Eastern Front, navigation has become a convenient part of our sub-regional dynamics. Navigation happening from Nepal to India, navigation happening from India to Bangladesh. So it is politically more convenient to look at the Ganga and build on the sharing benefits rather the Indus, because it is politically very difficult to create sharing benefit on the Indus River.
Are there any further questions? If there are questions, please raise your hands. In the meantime, as I mentioned, there are a couple of things that I wanted to raise, and these are my questions. So in parts, of course, you talk historically about the kind of conflicts or disputes that existed between provinces like Sindh and Punjab, which in fact is something that post-independence Pakistan has also been kind of wrought with, and there's a lot of conflict within Pakistan that there's not much emphasis that is laid on that, but in reality there is a lot of infighting that is happening within Pakistan on the waters of the Indus. So, and your book actually talks more about some of the historical precedents as well to some of these disputes. So, can you also maybe reflect a bit on, I mean, along with the Pakistani perspective that you also gave a while ago, can you also give an idea of how these internal conflicts or disputes can affect the external, the Indus Waters Treaty signed between India and Pakistan?
Yes, indeed. I think what we need to worry, and what history also tells us, the numerous disputes between Sindh and Punjab, and also on our side, when you examine some of the other river basin disputes between our provinces on the rivers, what it tells us is that the domestic management of river sharing can have a direct impact on the transboundary sharing of the water between two states. So I think the domestic and the transboundary, the interstate relationship is quite linked, I think. So many of the troubles that happen on Sindh versus Punjab on the Indus actually gets reflected on the Indus between India and Pakistan. I think there is also a political establishment that determines a certain narrative on water based on the dynamics of politics that exists. Often, I think the idea is deliberate for the establishment in Pakistan to create uncertainty around water sharing of its provinces so that the blame is articulated effectively towards India, which is not really the case. But I think this is sort of misinformation and misperception that builds into water issues. I think let's not forget that there's a whole thing about misperception on waters. I think that plays into the politics of it. Each elections in Bangladesh has the emotive element of water with India, and the narrative is often that India is a water hegemon, that it's stealing the water, it is manipulating the water, etc. It feeds into the domestic politics. It creates a sense of alarm, creates a sense of uncertainty. It creates a sense of anger against an external country. And therefore, it also absorbs some of the domestic approaches or the water management practices that these countries do. I think we have settled much of this with Bangladesh. I think there's a greater amount of cooperation in terms of water management practices, water efficiency, ways to deal with water crisis. But unfortunately, on the Indus with Pakistan, water still remains political, remains divisive, and remains very emotive. Um, Also, I think, if you look at the leadership role here between India and Pakistan, and the leadership is an important element of the book. From time to time, we have seen effective leadership taking effective decisions on the Indus Basin, whether it was in terms of creating more canals for irrigation during the British Empire, and we see a lot of viceroys and governor generals exercising their decision here, or whether it was in terms of creating dispute resolution mechanisms on the Indus, which many viceroys did. I think leadership played a very important role. And this is something to learn. And the leadership today also can play a very important role. I think India's leadership here, led by the Prime Minister, wants to make, if there's any forward movement with Pakistan, it is clearly based on dividing, the society from the establishment. So I think the emphasis, therefore, for India would be concern about the citizens of Pakistan, people of Pakistan, their concerns, their need, their requirement. And therefore, the water fits into that concern area, the concern of the people. And establishment, we have clearly made a distinction here. The establishment is political. It has a narrative which is based on enemy construct. And therefore, we have to approach that very differently. I think this is the kind of patterns that seems to be emerging. The rivers on the eastern front are far more what I describe as dynamic and moving forward, where the sheer benefits are being formulated. Unfortunately, on the Western front, we still rely on the Indus Waters Treaty, which was a treaty to mediate the political difficulties.
Yes. So there's one question about Radcliffe, how he drew the line. And in fact, one of the things that he envisaged while drawing the line was that there would be a joint management of the basin, right? Which never really fructified. But as we see, what are the lessons that we could learn from that envisioning at that point in time from history? And whether that would be a reality in the future, that there could be a joint basin management, which is probably the way to go forward as we are talking about so many different changes that we are seeing to the hydrological regime itself of the Indus Basin.
Yeah, again, very interesting. I think all these things that happened in the past plays out today. I think we have often, at least not politically yet, asked this question, but at least those who are looking at the basin and the hydrology have often asked this question also in general debates, academic debates and expert level debates, whether the basin can be now looked at as a joint exercise, it's joint basin management, and whether it will be useful, whether it will be meaningful, can it hold the distance, etc. And I think we all come to a conclusion for any bilateral arrangement in a new format that is beyond the Indus Waters Treaty that exists, has to have a right political climate. Until unless there isn't a right political climate between the two, you will not get what is called a new treaty on the Indus. I think India, while the treaty, and I must say here, while the treaty was very engineering in its design, the engineers would have invested their mind in the treaty, and therefore there's a lot of annexures and technical details in the treaty. I think they also had an Article 7 which talked about future cooperation. I think they left a little space. Of course, they didn't know how things will evolve in the coming decades, but I think they were far-sighted enough to leave a little space called future cooperation, which obviously means that the basin is never static. The basin is dynamic and changes, the demand increases, the supply fluctuates, and also the new added pressure of climate change on the flow of the rivers. So yes, there is this room for future cooperation. What the future cooperation will look like, what format will be determined by mutual understanding and mutual agreement, which obviously requires a good political climate. We do not have that yet, but when it comes to, probably the Indus Basin needs to be talked about in a different light. It would require a different format. The Indus Treaty has outlived its purpose. I think it had a limited sort of role to play. It was a product of the partition of the land. Let's be very clear, and therefore the division of the basin happened. It had a limited purpose. I think we have utilized a great amount of what the treaty provides both countries. India, of course, has not, but India is moving on that line to utilize the provisions. Once the provisions have been utilized, I think it is time, therefore, to think about a new dialogue and a new process on the basin. However, as I emphasized earlier, that would require a political understanding. And at this stage, I do not see that coming.
Yeah. Thank you. So there's just one more question, which I think would be a good way to end this discussion, and hopefully, like you said, most of our students will read the book and then have more questions to ask about its content. But this is about how you have actually, throughout the book, what you clearly re-emphasize is the fact that Indus has been a theater of conflicts and peace. So that you have periods of conflicts, wars, and then you have periods of peace. And this is a cycle which Indus has seen forever. And in that sense, one of the things that you mentioned in some, at least towards the end of the book, you mentioned about peace building. And whether, and this is something that Dr. Nandkishore also mentioned about the confidence building measures, and whether this could be the way forward for seeking peace between India and Pakistan. And you and I also have read a lot about environmental peace building as well, which is something that, again, something that World Bank, for instance, did talk about when they entered the negotiations way back in the 50s. So I was just wondering if you could talk about how the cycle, whether that is also going to be uninterrupted and uninterruptible, or how the cycle is going to be in as we move ahead. Yeah.
Well, as we have seen in the history of the basin has always been sort of at an interface with new knowledge. Every time there's been a new intervention, sometimes technical intervention, sometimes ecological understanding. There's always been an interface of the basin with the dynamics, the external dynamics. The 60 years after 1960 has been remarkable in any sense that the treaty has survived, has worked. The Indus commissioners have met. Only last year, because of the pandemic situation, they could not. And at one point of time, because of the Balakot, I think the commissioners' talk were postponed, it wasn't cancelled. So I think the mechanism within the treaty, the dispute and difference resolution mechanism that was put into the treaty itself was a wise thought, because water does create difficulties, it creates animosities, and I think the technical engineers realized that, and therefore they had this mechanism within the treaty itself, which has worked quite effectively. I think the idea now is to bring in some new set of knowledge into the understanding of the treaty. And there is no exit clause of the treaty. So we'll have to look at a new framework. And that framework will obviously have to come about with new knowledge, new understanding, new data sets, the whole study of the glacier melts on the Karakoram, the Himalayan range, which feed into the Indus. Remember, the western rivers are more glacial fed than the eastern rivers. As you move east, the glacial component, the snow and ice component recedes, whereas on the western front with the Indus, there's a huge component of snow melt into the river. So I think we need some new set of knowledge, convincing knowledge, not just partial knowledge, that can then give us that body of evidences in which we can create a new understanding. For example, what are in the next 5 to 10 years the socio-economic gains from the Indus Basin? That kind of study needs to be done. Is, for example, hydroelectricity still a good way to move forward on the western rivers? Is that not a risky proposition with seismic evidences, with the huge cost that is put into building hydroelectricity? Is it viable in terms of economic cost, in terms of ecological cost? I think these are studies that are required to be done. I know hydroelectricity makes a lot of sense because there are provisions in the treaty that says you have to do these following things, and therefore we have many projects. But we've been very delayed on these projects. If these projects had come in the 80s and 90s, and even in the early decade of the 21st century, it would have been useful now. But now to think about these projects in the next 5 to 6 years requires a sort of cost-benefit analysis. I know the government is going full steam, and correctly so, in building these projects. But we need to take a step back and think whether these hydro projects will fit into the changing nature of the hydrology today. See the kind of effects that projects have had on the Uttarakhand. It can become a huge man-made disaster. Seismic evidences, for example, and even the design of the dams these days require new knowledge. The whole siltation and the kind of pressure it has on dams is something that we have to calculate. Remember, all the Indus rivers in particular carry a huge amount of silt, just like the Brahmaputra, just like the Ganga. They are huge silt-driven rivers. Uh, Rivers are not just about water; it's also about silts. It's also about aquatic life that comes around it. It's also about the cultural sort of interface that we would have. So there are so many elements that we need to bring into the Indus Basin and not be just structured by the provisions of the treaty. As I said, those were created in the 60s, it had its limited purpose. Fortunately, India could fulfill those provisions quickly enough. So that's how we should look at the Indus Commissioners meeting is a good space where you can bring in these issues to discuss, at least to start off. And then after some stage, political dialogue and a political understanding can come about in which some new arrangements and new formats then determined.
Yeah, all right. Thank you so much. So we have come to the end of this book discussion, but there's a lot more to say. In fact, I had a lot of things to say. I mean, this book has a lot for anybody who is interested in history, political science, international relations. In fact, there's also so much of detailing that has been done as viewed from the eyes of travelers, and it's a beautiful travelogue. In part of the book is actually travelogues written by travelers who came to this part of the world from other parts of the world. So there's so much richness in the book, and it's something that, as the author himself mentioned, it's something that even a 7th, 8th grade student can also read and enjoy. And this is not just for scholars of international relations, but it's for the lay person who would like to know the history of the subcontinent, and the Indus being a much principal part of it. It's very important that we know this history more than anyone else. So let me deliver the vote of thanks now formally. Thank you so much, Dr. Sinha, for taking time out to do this book discussion with us and to enlighten us with so many things about the Indus, the basin, the politics around it, the territorial contestations around it, the hydrology of it, and even the future of the Indus Waters Treaty, which is so critical to understanding and finding the solutions to not just peace between the two countries, but also in terms of what we are looking at as the biggest crisis that humankind is seeing in terms of the climate crisis and the environmental crisis itself. So thank you once again for this book discussion and for agreeing to come to the department, at least virtually, and discuss this book with us. And I'm very sure that most of the students will also now find it interesting enough to read it. I would also like to thank Dr. Nand Kishore, head in charge of Department of Geopolitics and International Relations, for giving the opportunity to organize this book discussion. And I'm very happy that when I took this proposal to him, he was very happy to have it as soon as possible. But because of certain difficulties, because of the situation in the campus itself, like we couldn't have it last week, but I'm glad that we could do it at least this week. And hopefully we'll continue the discussions. And I would also like to thank the university, Manipal Academy of Higher Education, for giving us a platform to do this online. And also my colleagues who have helped me organize this program. And I would like to especially thank the students. At least a lot of them have actually turned up, which is very, very good of them, because like I mentioned, they have gone through a bit of a problem in the past couple of weeks, and I'm glad that many of them have come online and are listening to this, and I'm sure that they would like to engage with this book in the future. So once again, thank you so much, Dr. Sinha, and hope to see you in Manipal maybe once the things normalize. But otherwise, as Dr. Nankishore also mentioned, we would like to engage with you much more on many issues regarding international relations, history, political science, and so on. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Dhanashree. It was a pleasure, and I know it's not the same as meeting everyone live and seeing them physically, but yeah, we have to do with whatever is available at this moment. So thank you very much, and fantastically conducted, I must say. Really impressed. And let me tell you, this is the first book discussion. I think there are many book discussions that are going to happen this month, but I think it's been wonderful to kickstart the discussion with Manipal University. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much once again. Bye. Take care.
All right. Thank you. All the best.
Yeah.